Hello and welcome back to a brand new DNF1 F1 podcast. How are you? I hope that you are all doing well, and thank you once again for being here. It's great to have you along, and we have got a great topic of discussion for this episode. For those of you that weren't aware, news broke just yesterday at the point of recording that Daniel Ricciardo will be returning to Formula 1. That's right, I'll repeat that. The Honey Badger himself is coming back to the F1 grid. Not so long ago, we were discussing whether or not we would expect to see Daniel Ricciardo race in Formula 1. It's only taken 10 races since his last time out, and he is already joining the grid once again. He will be replacing Nyck De Vries in the Alpha Tauri team as part of the Red Bull program, of course, and discussing what went down, why this move has happened, and what this could mean for Red Bull and Alpha Tauri going forward into the future. We've got F1 journalist joining us this afternoon. We have Sam Coop joining us from FormulaNerds. Sam, first of all, thanks for coming on the show. First time on. Great to have you. How are you, mate?
Yeah, I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you asked me on, and your listeners probably noticed that I have a very, very similar name to Sam Cooper, not to be confused.
Yeah, I think it's important because I think some of our ardent listeners who may not be watching this on YouTube, if they're listening to us on their favourite audio podcast platform. By the way, guys, leave us a 5-star review on there if you are listening to us on that. Yeah, they probably get confused by the name, that there is a distinct difference between yourself and Sam, although I'm sure Sam won't mind me saying the facial hair for you, Samuel, is definitely top tier by comparison. Not that I can talk, I can only grow a bit of a stubble by comparison, so Sam Cooper has got me well beat on that one anyway, so I'm sure he won't mind.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Well, of course, Sam, given it's your first time on the show with us, we have a bit of protocol that we like to put forward with our guests, and that's a bit of an icebreaker question to get to know a little bit more about their F1 interest. So if I may throw it your way, if I was to give you any F1 car from history, and you could drive it anywhere you wanted to in the world, any circuit, it could be a local kart track for a day, what car are we driving, and where are you driving it?
Ooh, that is a very, very good question. I've got to go with, and apologies for not knowing the name of the car off the top of my head, probably the 2008 McLaren,
Ooh.
Hamilton's first championship winning car, and it would be Sao Paulo. It would be Interlagos.
Yeah, you know, that's a beautiful combination, obviously for historical reasons, but Sao Paulo, very underrated circuit, and I think over the years, I think the sprint races there of recent years have actually warmed a lot more people to that circuit as a circuit that does often provide great racing. So I really like that choice, and it was a very interesting car to drive. I think a lot of people probably take for granted how well balanced these modern day F1 cars are, given how big they are. Back in 2008, when Lewis won his first world title, that was a very difficult, hard car to handle. So it just was a real testament to how good those drivers were.
Oh, completely. I don't know about you, but I kind of miss seeing the twitchiness through a corner, like really kind of having the driver wrestling the wheel. But the modern speeds that they're able to corner out is something to behold in itself.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I was at Silverstone last weekend, and I remember watching the cars go through Maggots and Beckett's, and for me, it was so tough you could tell that the best cars out of the field, but if someone asked me which one is the worst one, I thought, well, I think that'd be a bit unfair because they all look relatively comfortable in that area. It's just some are better than others. But you could rewind 15 years ago back to that era, and there would have been twitchy. The drivers would have been fighting the cars all over the place. It would have been so difficult to handle. The spectacle itself would have been even more thrilling than it was last weekend seeing the modern day cars. So I totally understand what you mean. I miss it too. I miss the sound, but maybe one day in a more environmentally friendly manner, if possible. But of course, we are getting a bit sidetracked here, obviously away from the topic at hand. Usually on this show, Sam, I do go off tangent a little bit, so I'll try and reel myself back in. The news regarding Daniel Ricciardo, big breaking news. And first of all, I think I wanted to focus a little bit on the Nyck De Vries element in this. Are we surprised that Nyck De Vries has been removed from the Alpha Tauri team?
No, I'm also not surprised at the, to be direct the unceremonious way in which it's happened as well. That's very much the Red Bull philosophy. You make the change, you do it quick and kind of hopefully painless long term. But I am surprised at the timing. There was very much a look. He's got 4 races, and I also thought the timing was that by that plan was also quite harsh because that the next race would have been Zandvoort, Nick's home Grand Prix, but the summer break is when Red Bull Alpha Tauri have traditionally made those moves. Helmut Marko obviously saying that there was 4 races and that was before Austria, so it is a little bit of a surprise that it's happened before Hungary.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I was very surprised because whilst I expected Nyck De Vries to be shown the door or to be replaced, I, like yourself, expected it to come around the summer break. Dr. Helmut Marko's quote saying he had about 4 races left to impress. The writing was always on the wall. It was just a case of everyone sitting there thinking, okay, it's probably going to happen in the summer break. We can probably speculate who's going to replace him. But it happened very, very quickly. And I think around about, even before Silverstone, we were getting indications or hints that Red Bull were looking to move Nyck De Vries out, and the likely alternative was going to be Daniel Ricciardo. And as it was, literally a day or so after Silverstone, after the tyre test that Ricciardo had done, the decision was made very, very quickly. Are you surprised, not necessarily by the response or the social media report or the social media news, I suppose, broadcasts from Red Bull and Alpha Tauri? Are you more surprised that we haven't heard a lot from Formula One or any affiliated parties with that? Because if I'm honest, Sam, I've not really seen hardly anybody that's not affiliated with an F1 team or a partner actually talk much about Nyck De Vries, even as much as just to wish him well.
You're absolutely right on that. It's been I saw someone do some analysis of the number of posts that Formula One had done from the start of the season on Nyck De Vries, and it was like 2 or 3, and then they were already into their 20s on Daniel Ricciardo posts within the day that he was announced as taking the AlphaTauri seat, which says a lot. It says a lot about where Daniel's place in the paddock and how he's regarded in F1 circles. I think a lot of it is maybe just wanting to leave Nick alone, let him grieve, mourn, kind of come to terms with that process. But I would have liked to see more well-wishing from official kind of affiliates, as you say. A lot of the fan base were very much like, look, this is harsh, this is early, and so on and so forth. But I think Nick just needs some downtime, some time away from racing to kind of plan his next move. So I think maybe that's partly to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I saw a few photos floating around today of Toto Wolff and Nyck De Vries sitting down together, which looked like a lunch at Monaco. So, make of that what you will, guys. Of course, Mick Schumacher was unceremoniously removed from Haas last season to Toto Wolff's gain because he picked him up as the reserve driver. Maybe something may pan out for Nyck De Vries in that element as well. Obviously, they do have a history together, so we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I was surprised too. And I completely agree with you, Sam. I think that there is an element to this that Ricciardo is a huge stable in Formula One. He's one of the most marketable drivers on the grid, arguably second behind Sir Lewis Hamilton in that regard. So it was obviously going to be a big thing. I imagine with Liberty Media's involvement as well, 2 more US races later on this season, especially Las Vegas, they're going to be absolutely buzzing that Ricciardo is going to be going there from a marketing perspective as well.
Oh, completely. I mean, Daniel Ricciardo in Vegas is a license to print money, and let's face it, F1 doesn't shy away from an opportunity to print money. So, yeah, it's there's a lot to be excited about, but I think that for me the biggest question is ultimately comes down to what Daniel Ricciardo are we going to get from next weekend? Are we going to get the Daniel Ricciardo of his early Red Bull career, or are we going to get the McLaren Daniel Ricciardo? Because I think that changes that moves the needle on how the rest of the season goes.
Absolutely. And that is going to be the talking point that a lot of people, including ourselves, are going to be focusing on throughout the remainder of this season. Of course, we'll have a couple of races before the summer break where you'd imagine Ricciardo would want to find his feet, but given he's going to the Red Bull Junior team, and there's going to be a lot of elements to that car that I'm sure he'll be familiar with his time at Red Bull doing the sim work and the tyre test, it shouldn't be too much of an integration as perhaps it would have been for Nyck De Vries when he was joining the team 6 months ago, having a background at practically half the grid, excluding, of course, Red Bull and AlphaTauri.
Yeah, Daniel's a seasoned pro. He's a veteran. He's got a wealth of experience in different settings to fall back on. Yes, Nyck has a more maybe diverse racing experience, but I think this is kind of also the nucleus of why Daniel was the decision that Alpha Tauri and Red Bull ultimately came to, is that you can put Daniel in the car and he's a better barometer, a better litmus test for where the car should be. Someone to benchmark against Yuki in a better way than a Liam Lawson would have been. So I think that's a lot of the thinking. And obviously, when it comes to AlphaTauri or Red Bull, it's a wider picture. It's not just two seats; it's always four, so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking back at Red Bull's history of their ruthlessness, I suppose, when it comes to replacing drivers, this isn't the first time that they've replaced a driver mid-season. I mean, I was looking online earlier today, and I think it was about, this is the fifth time they've done that since Red Bull's inception in 2006, where I think the first was Christian Klein being replaced by Robert Dornbos. In the 2006 season, then we had Scott Speed was replaced by Sebastian Vettel. I think we can all agree that worked out pretty well for Red Bull at the time. Sebastian Bourdais replaced by Jaime Alguersuari. Danny Kvyat replaced by Max Verstappen, of course, who went on to win his first race with the team, and of course has gone on to dominate F1 over the last couple of seasons. And more recently, Gasly being replaced by Alex Albon at the Red Bull team itself. So, Red Bull aren't unfamiliar, I suppose, with making this particular kind of change. They would probably put it down to being a rather successful practice, given the history of some of the changes that they've made. But looking back on Nyck De Vries' performances this season so far, Sam, and the fact that the car's also been quite bad, let's be honest, it's I think on one lap pace, according to the Delta, I think only Alfa Romeo have been slower on average throughout this season than AlphaTauri. Would we say that the removal of Nyck De Vries in such fashion was a fair one, or do you feel like he should have been afforded a bit more time?
I think really he should have been afforded some more time, given the difficulties with that car. And again, it's difficult because there is no real backmarker this year in the traditional sense. It's more of a kind of a second group, along with the Williams, the Alphas, and some of even the upper midfielders on a race by race basis. McLaren was certainly down there towards the beginning of the season. I think that's what makes it difficult to really kind of work out: is he underperforming? Is Yuki overperforming in the car? All those kind of things have worked against Nyck ultimately. But yeah, the pace wasn't there, and it wasn't so much that he was making those gradual, and he was improving, but he was still making little mistakes, and we don't obviously know what it's like behind the scenes, how he's being managed, how he wants to be managed. But he was very closed off over the weekend, very scripted, very PR'd, as you'd almost expect. But it was almost like he'd kind of shut down a little bit. Was in denial, knew it was coming, writing was on the wall. But I think they should have given him at least a season. He's not early in his racing career, but he also is early in his F1 racing career, so he needed more time to adjust.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a way we could probably pay tribute to Nyck De Vries at how good he was at trying to keep tight-lipped about these things, because as cutthroat and as ruthless as Red Bull are, this wouldn't have been a decision that they would have just made right then and there. This would have been premeditated for some time. As I said already, when I went to the Silverstone race last weekend, I was there watching De Vries and Tsunoda on the main stage doing the interviews with the AlphaTauri team, and I did often feel, looking back on it, that there was an element with Nyck De Vries where it did feel a little bit reserved, that he was happy to be there, but it almost felt like he was trying to take it all in, that this wasn't going to last much longer, where it was Yuki Tsunoda was beaming. He was absolutely happy, getting the crowd going, starting the Tsunoda chants, which of course lasted throughout the whole weekend. For those that there would obviously know what I was talking about. But yeah, very much a contrast between the two. And as I said, it did feel to me that the writing was very much on the wall for Nyck De Vries in that regard.
Yeah, completely. I think a lot of that is also down to Nick's personality. Like, even when he was in Formula E and he was performing well, he's not that fun, happy-go-lucky guy. He's not Daniel Ricciardo. Or Yuki Tsunoda and Pierre Gasly, the relationship, the rapport that they built up, that was a very fun, easygoing relationship between the two. And as per kind of the waiting to make the decision, or it being writing on the wall, I think if you look at the Gasly decision, in 2019, it felt like within a very few races that they were looking around going, "Nah, this isn't it. He's not swimming in this environment. He's sinking here." And I think the same feeling would have been had about Nyck from within the first 2 or 3 races.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, if we don't see much on social media of well wishes within the F1 circle, the very least that we can do as fans, or at least I can do on this podcast, is wish Nyck De Vries well in whatever he does next, because I've always rated him fairly highly. I mean, there is always going to be that element that some very, very good drivers just aren't quite good enough to cut it in F1, and hopefully he can go on to be successful elsewhere. He already has been successful, as you mentioned already, in Formula E and obviously in F2. We've seen many other drivers not quite make it in Formula 1 and go on to make very successful careers for themselves in other sports. And I'm pretty confident Nyck De Vries, whatever he goes on to do next, will be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope if he doesn't go back to Formula E, I hope there's lots of other motorsport, IndyCar, for example, or endurance racing. He can still have a fruitful career. Antonio Giovinazzi being evidence of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, in Giovinazzi's case, it just goes to show that even at Ferrari, you can still win sometimes in the modern era. So there's always hope for everybody in that regard. Had to get that one in there. My followers will know why. But Sam, of course, regarding the decision to bring in Nyck De Vries, it was a rather unorthodox one where, Red Bull and Alpha Tauri, they were looking for the driver to replace Pierre Gasly when he made the switch to Alpine for 2023. And there was a short list of drivers. We had, of course, Liam Lawson in there. Ricciardo was a driver on that list, but he originally didn't want that seat at Alpha Tauri going into the 2023 season. Of course, we'll talk a bit about that later on. They also had potentially Mick Schumacher, who in their mind wasn't quite ready for them, or they felt wasn't quite good enough for them, and obviously ended up being of Mercedes gain in that regard. And Colton Herta as well, who I'm pretty certain Alpha Tauri would have been able to bring him in via Red Bull if he was eligible, but he wasn't because he didn't have the super license points to get that done. So you take all of that in, it left an open door for someone like Nyck De Vries to put in a performance like he did at Monza last season, which was impressive under the circumstances, although looking back you can apply some caveats that perhaps diluted the level of performance that he put in certain corners. And Dr. Helmut Marko was his biggest supporter. There was a lot of arguments and discussion at Red Bull. Christian Horner was, according to Dr. Helmut himself on another podcast, he said that Christian wasn't a fan of De Vries. He didn't want him in. There were other corners at Red Bull that didn't want De Vries in. They didn't think he had quite what it took to cut it at that team. But Dr. Helmut Marko stuck his neck out and brought him in. And he was the one that was very vocal about De Vries' future as well, saying that, he's got this many races left, or the writing could be on the wall, we've got these plans. Now that Red Bull have finally made that decision to replace him, and in quite dramatic fashion, quite early on compared to what we would expect from Red Bull, even by their ruthless standards, isn't our concern going forward at Red Bull, or perhaps in some corners, that the recruitment decisions may require a little bit more scrutiny before they're done, or are Red Bull going to require new strategies of their recruitment?
I think both, really. I think that the reason why Marco was maybe so harsh on De Vries and saying stuff like, Perez performs well in the races in contrast to Nyck De Vries, and like comparing the two drivers who are obviously under pressure at the moment, I think comes from the fact that decision last year was made with a level of haste. I don't think, after the Williams performance, you look at the overall situation, you go, okay, well, you got Logan Sargent, who's a Williams junior, but if he doesn't get the super license points, after the stance the FIA have made with Colton Herta, you've got to assume they're not going to make an exception for Logan Sargent. They may have done, but you couldn't assume. Then Williams would have moved pretty quickly, potentially, to get Nyck De Vries in the car, which would have left AlphaTauri potentially going, well, what do we do now? Daniel Ricciardo doesn't want the seat. We're not big on Mick Schumacher. Where do we go from here? Liam Lawson's not ready, and Emil Iwassa's not ready. So I think there was a level of, we've got to rush with this. So yeah, it was the flawed decision-making process from start to finish, which again is maybe why they've been so hasty in making that call. What it says to me is a changing of their approach, and you started to get understanding of this when they announced that they're changing the name of Alpha Tauri for next season. And it was very much a returning to a B team as opposed to a junior team, which implies that we're not necessarily going to go for so much youth. We're not necessarily going to give them as much time and it be a development ground. And there's a real departure there in how they've handled Nyck De Vries compared to Sergio Perez, where Red Bull was traditionally the more cutthroat and brutal environment, where you're not performing, you're out. Qualifying is a big part of the weekend. He's got to fix that soon, Sergio. He knows that. So yeah, there's definitely a changing there within the team, but ultimately they need to take their share of responsibility here. It was a flawed process from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it kind of tells us a very telling story about the current state of the Red Bull young driver program at the moment. I mean, it's been a while, in all honesty, that Red Bull have been able to unearth a gem from that youth academy. I think you probably have to argue that Max Verstappen was the last real gem that they found. I mean, you can argue a case for perhaps Gasly and Alex Albon in certain regards, although I think Gasly came before Verstappen anyway. So, but the jury will still be out on those long term. And even if they separate themselves from Red Bull entirely, they're still very decent Grand Prix drivers. But since then, we've often teased at the potential of some young drivers, like the likes of Liam Lawson or Ayumi Iwasa, who look ready to have at least an opportunity or be in the conversation. But beyond that, you start to have to wonder at Red Bull, is it worth their time to continue and persist with this program when there are many drivers I haven't mentioned already? I mean, the likes of Brendan Hartley, for example, who was brought in, then got rid of, brought in again. Other drivers like Jaime Alguersuari, just off the top of my head right now. And Red Bull are committing a lot to a program where they want to churn out potential world champions, but other than Vettel and Verstappen, it's been a very costly and unfulfilling process in certain regards.
Completely, and it's that, is it an environment that's so pressurized, so difficult that it either makes you, it makes you or breaks you, basically. And there's only a few that are ever going to be really of the Red Bull caliber that's what we want, and we identify that. And yes, there's a lot of collateral damage in the process, but that just is how it is. Or is there inherently in the system, are they damaging the development of these drivers because of how difficult it is? And it's very difficult to put yourself in a position of a racing driver psychologically, because I think to get to anywhere near the level that the F2, F3 drivers are at, you need to fully be able to believe that you are the best and you can be the best. There's so much to say about sports psychology. Dennis Hauger, for example, though, has fallen away this season. He's really struggled. And he's gone from that kind of, surely he's the next one. Won the F3 title, looked convincing. And he's fallen away. So Red Bull are starting to indicate that actually they're going to change their tact. That they're too thin across the board. They've got so many juniors in F2 and F3. Do we want to focus more on specifics? Because, you've got, Hauger, as I said, has fallen away. Iwasa, I think, is probably a year or two away from being ready. He's there. He's got the speed, but he's raw. Enzo Fittipaldi has not been as convincing as I was expecting in the Carlin. Zay Maloney's still in his first F2 season. Jack Crawford and Isaac Hadjar, both in their first F2 seasons. Hadjar, potentially. Crawford, I don't think really is Red Bull material. And they're even kind of now talking about Pepe Marti in F3, along with Sebas Montoya, who's part of the program as well. So there's a lot there, but are any of them anywhere near the level that you'd be expecting? I don't know. It's difficult to kind of tell at this stage.
Do you think in a way that the success of a driver like Max Verstappen, not even Sebastian Vettel in this regard, because obviously he was the first of that breed of drivers to come through, but because of how Max Verstappen got into Formula One at such a young age and because he was such an exceptional talent, do you think in a way that's probably corrupted the hierarchy at Red Bull into thinking that every potential young driver that they bring into their academy has to be measured against that benchmark, when in some respects it's almost impossible to match up against?
Yes and no, because they've got rid of drivers that they didn't feel were we're up to. I mean, J.N. de Ruvla has been taken off the bill. Who there was another driver, Johnny Edgar, has been taken off the bill. Yeah, they do remove drivers from the setup, but I think also there's that element of, if Max is at the top of his game and is one of the greatest talents in F1 history, let's face it, when all said and done, he probably will be the most decorated F1 driver of all time, the way he's going. What's the point in finding the next Max Verstappen when you've got Max Verstappen? You're set up for a clear A driver and B driver in that team. Do you want to change your tack and go for a more kind of Nico Lewis Mercedes dynamic, or dare I say a Max Daniel Red Bull dynamic? Is it worth it for them? I think that's what they're now considering. They're trying to weigh it up.
Yeah, it's an important point, and I suppose with an academy the size of Red Bulls, they've contributed a lot in terms of the personnel on the F1 grid. But rightly so, that if they're going to put that money in and they want to unearth the next Max Verstappen and the next Sebastian Vettel, they are going to be ruthless in the standards that are required. I suppose in some regards, the benefit of the new rules with the super license, i.e. you're not allowed to have one until you're 18, kind of works in favour of some of the drivers, where Red Bull aren't looking at 15, 16-year-olds thinking, right, how are they going to fare in a Formula One car like they did with Max Verstappen? So, there is that element to it too.
Oh, completely. And I also think for every Oscar Piastri or Max Verstappen or someone who comes through the ranks quickly and young, and we've seen a few drivers, performing well before they're 20 in F1, you also get the Victor Martins or the Felipe Drugoviches who take a little bit more time, but because they've been allowed to mature, they look a more complete, more ready driver by the time they get to F1 or get near to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. I mean, how old was Sir Lewis Hamilton when he was in Formula? What was he, 22, 23? And, Fernando Alonso. Yeah, Fernando Alonso was quite young, early 20s as well. So it almost feels like, are we lowering the bar too much, I suppose, as fans as well, when we're looking at the age of drivers? It's almost like we've gone down that football route where you're looking to unearth the next Ronaldo or Messi when they're 16 years of age and they get signed to something crazy like Real Madrid and you expect them to be amazing and then they don't. And it's almost like, well, is the system at fault or is the talent just not really there? Like, which one is it? Because it almost feels like in that regard, you could say the Red Bull Junior program are kind of guilty of the same problem.
Absolutely, yeah, completely. Like, there are a couple of Barcelona youths that ended up playing for like Stoke. I forget it was not DeSantos.
Oh, was it Hussein?
Bojan.
Oh, Bojan, of course. Yeah.
He was the next Messi, but he obviously wasn't. So yeah, I see the similarities. I see the parallels to that. But I also think that the sport has changed. You're not going to get someone like Damon Hill coming in at 31, doing a decade, winning a title in the process. I just think it's changed. The psychology, the lower reaches of the sport, and also the psychology of it, and also the sport science of it. You've got Fernando Alonso driving into his mid-40s. He's 41, 42. So who knows when he'll retire? So the game's changed, and I think we're still trying to work out exactly what the most productive way forward is for young drivers.
Yeah, I mean, I really wish they would go back to looking for the next Damon Hill or something like that, because then it'd give the rest of us a chance who haven't had an opportunity yet, well into their 30s. So you never know.
Exactly. I mean, but equally, you could end up being the next Nyck De Vries. So that's the risk.
I don't know.
And I think, I mean, give me 11 races in F1 car, I'd be happy.
I was just thinking the same thing. I'll happily do that. But I would like to have raced at Silverstone. I feel for De Vries not being able to have the opportunity to race at his home race. That's obviously quite a crushable. Even if the attention was obviously going to be on Verstappen, that would have been nice for him to have that. Moving on to Ricciardo, because of course we should talk about him.
Yep.
Ricciardo coming in at this point of the season, there's obviously going to be a lot of questions asked of, why is he doing it now? What is there to gain from him? Is there a view to it being perhaps the reward of something much greater than this if he proves to be successful? I think first of all, Sam, I think the first thing we have to ask is, why is Daniel Ricciardo agreeing to join a team that he turned down more than 6 months ago when he was leaving McLaren?
I think firstly, I don't think he really felt he could say no. I think, secondly, going into the season, it was difficult to know that Yuki Tsunoda would have taken that step forward that he has. He looks more composed. He looks a much more complete driver this year than he has done, very much to Franz Tost's kind of 3-year philosophy that he has for drivers. Also, you now have a clear benchmark against how De Vries was doing. How far was he behind Tsunoda on average? Does Ricciardo have to come in and just kind of better that? Or does he have to actually better Tsunoda? We don't know where those metrics are. We don't know what a good half a season looks like for Daniel Ricciardo. But I think he's got that half season to fall back on. So it's an easier proposition for him. Also, from a kind of wider perspective, it's a win-win situation, or it's a can't lose situation for him. If he doesn't, do that well, and that is that, he got another half a season in F1 car. I certainly thought that his career was said and done in F1. If he does perform well, outperform Tsunoda or matches, or does whatever the Red Bull family want, he potentially opens up the opportunity to take that Red Bull seat. So yeah, it makes sense in my head for Ricciardo. Also, he gets to race at Vegas. Let's not minimise that in the decision-making process. We know how big he was on that. But I think what's really interesting is the use of the on loan wording in the press release. Not because that's new, because that's ultimately how Red Bull structure their contracts. That's how they've been able to make those mid-season changes before. But the fact that they actually mentioned that in the press release does say a lot. It's very much a look. If we like what we see, we'll take him back. Thanks. It's a clear nod to that, and I think that's maybe to give Sergio Perez a bit of a kick up the arse.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And when I saw the news, I thought to myself, okay, the dominoes are starting to fall where Red Bull probably would want them to, because at this point, Nyck De Vries always seemed like a bit of a stopgap signing anyway. I know we just spent the first portion of this episode sort of, pouring our hearts out to him, saying we feel for him. But ultimately, I never felt that the Nyck De Vries acquisition was ever going to be a long-term option. As it were, perhaps Red Bull got rid of him sooner than they probably would have preferred. I don't imagine they would have signed a driver on for 6 months and then gotten rid of him when a better option came. But ever since Ricciardo came back to this Red Bull team, it always felt inevitable that it was just going to be a little bit more than just a marketing ploy or a pseudo reserve driver, if you like, that was going to step in if ever needed. And now that it's happened, a lot of people have raised the question, why go back to someone like Ricciardo when he's had his time at Red Bull? He left McLaren, well, he was bought out of his McLaren contract rather than being able to stay there to get Piastri in. Why not go for someone new like Liam Lawson and see if he can prove, or even Ayumu Iwasa, to prove that they have what it takes to be in this team long term?
I think they wouldn't want to take Iwasa out of his F2 season midway through. I think they want to see if he can recover in the championship fight. It's it was a decent weekend in Silverstone, but it's very much he's really got to take it to Fred Vesti and Teo Porcher over the rest of the year. But he is there or thereabouts. Same with Liam Lawson. He's P2 in Super Formula. He's won 2 races out of the first 5. He could win that title. I also think that whilst Liam Lawson is immediately quick, and we've seen that he's been competitive or won very early in each category he's raced in, often on debut, like with Super Formula, like with F2. And you look at last season, he went P3, P2, P1, retired from a podium position in the 4th race, and it tailed away from there. He could have well been in the championship fight. But I think, again, it comes back to that, what's a more realistic benchmark? Because let's face it, Liam Lawson would still just be a rookie you're putting in the car. You don't actually get as much information from that as you do someone like Daniel Ricciardo, and you can go, right, he's a seasoned vet, he knows what he's doing. So that's, I think, where that decision-making process basically comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's important to mention as well, of course, is, when we're talking about Liam Lawson, there is that element that this probably is the wrong time, more than Naomi Iwasa in this case, to put him in that F1 seat. Now, I'm sure if it was offered to Liam, he'd bite your hand off for it, but Red Bull seem to have a plan for him in the short to medium term anyway, whether it's put him in that Alpha Tauri in 24, or if for whatever reason Ricciardo had to stay another year or something happened, they could put him in 25. The options are there for Liam, and in some ways, this opportunity, whilst it would have been a golden one for him, probably came a little bit too soon. He still needs to hone himself perhaps in Super Formula, where he's doing very well right now, obviously very experienced in Formula 2, and again, this provides Red Bull that opportunity to see what they have in Ricciardo or even Tsunoda and Perez going forward before they make that decision on Lawson in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if I had a crystal ball, I mean, it'd be fantastic to see where things were coming down the line. Liam Lawson is next man up. Perez, if he can't, fix his slide, or he can't acquiesce his position within the team, he got very hot into the, look, I can do a Nico Rosberg this season. I mean, we all were writing, thought pieces on, can he be the Nico Rosberg this season? And he can't be. And so now, even if he does kind of settle down, get back into where they would expect him to be on a Saturday, and therefore getting 1-2s on a Sunday, he's going to have to play second fiddle. Does he want to do that long term? Daniel Ricciardo, could he take the fight to Max? I really don't know if he could. Max is a very different driver from the driver he was when Ricciardo left Red Bull, but I think they're maybe hoping that you stick him back in an environment where he did well previously, and it's like you just turn the clock back. It's like the McLaren thing never happened. That's the gamble. But if one of those doesn't come through, just stick Liam Lawson in the Alpha Tauri. It seemingly is quite simple on that front.
Yeah, it does seem rather convenient for Red Bull that for once in the last few years, they do have a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. They're probably on plan B right now, but in a way, it still works out for them and gives them options going forward. So I'm sure over the next 6 months or so, or maybe even longer than that, we'll see how things play out, where those seats are. It's a nice little game of Red Bull Alpha Tauri musical chairs right now. It'll just be interesting to see who fills those spots. Talking about Ricciardo in particular, there was a lot of emphasis on the sim work that he's been doing this season. At the start of the season, one of Red Bull's entourage went as far as saying it was effing dreadful. And in addition to that, there has been improvements that have been made according to Red Bull over time, that Ricciardo has been much more representative of the pace they were hoping he would be at. A little bit of the old Ricciardo, if you like. How true that is, obviously only Red Bull and Ricciardo really know about this. But then there was the Pirelli tyre test at Silverstone just yesterday. And Red Bull, despite the fact that they were talking this up for some time beforehand, it was quite interesting to see some of the data that was being released from this tyre test. And we don't often get data or any timings or anything from the tyre test. Pirelli are usually very tight-lipped about these things. And of course, Pirelli are controlling the situations and circumstances that the drivers are doing the tyre testing. And I think the line from certain sources, according to Red Bull, was Daniel Ricciardo did a time of the 127s, which would have been good enough for the front row of the grid. I don't think that was true at all, actually. I think someone said it was, I can't remember what tyres he was doing it on, but they said the time itself would have been good enough for like a top 7, which obviously would have been better than what Perez had done, all jokes aside. But given the change of conditions compared to what we had in qualifying, and we don't know what the tyres would have been like compared to the soft tyres that they would have done their quali laps at Silverstone on Saturday, it is a little bit disingenuous in that regard. It almost felt like Red Bull were trying to justify the decision they were making to get rid of De Vries and put Ricciardo in and say, don't worry guys, Danny is back. It's not the Daniel Ricciardo of McLaren who's fallen away. He still knows how to drive an F1 car very fast.
Yeah, it's spin, it's PR, and let's face it, Red Bull are a huge drinks company, but they're actually more a marketing company, and that's what that is. Because yes, the time may have been good enough for the front row of the grid, but it was a weekend with changeable conditions, so the track is getting washed away and re-scrubbed in time and time again, and then based on weather conditions, a lap time that is good and representative can differ by well over a second, day to day or session by session. So that's not really representative. But I think it was look, we're making a good decision here. Here's something to back that up. And it's funny because I think from as I say, in the court of public opinion, they maybe felt that that's what they had to do, given how quick they were to axe Nyck De Vries.
I think it's funny that they went with the wording of front row rather than fastest time, because obviously they would have wanted to demonstrate or prove that Ricciardo was fast enough to put that car where it should have been, and that's right next to Max Verstappen, but not necessarily in front of him. Obviously, don't want to ruffle any feathers there, or recreate a rivalry that Max and Danny probably wouldn't have want to reflect on too much over the years since then. But in terms of the measuring stick for Ricciardo, where do you think that is? Because you touched on this earlier with Alpha Tauri. Tsunoda is going to be a very good barometer for Ricciardo. Is he expected to be as quick as Tsunoda? Does he need to beat Tsunoda? And also on the flip side, where does this sit for Tsunoda? Because he's in an interesting dynamic too now, because for him, this was almost a make or break season for him. He had to beat Nyck De Vries and beat him well. And I think we can all agree that he did that quite emphatically and has been the highlight for AlphaTauri this year. But now Ricciardo's coming into this team. Is there any increased pressure on Tsunoda's shoulders now? Does he need to demonstrate he can beat Ricciardo to be in the frame for Red Bull? Or does he just need to keep doing what he's doing and see what happens next?
Well, this is the thing, and this is testament to how dynamic and multifaceted this situation is. With Ricciardo, as I said before, are they expecting him to match Tsunoda or beat Tsunoda? And if surely Tsunoda has to beat Ricciardo to be to consider the Red Bull drive, or for Red Bull to consider putting Tsunoda in the drive rather. I think if he doesn't, I don't think they will. I think it's only if they kind of go, look, yes, Danny's just got in the car. Tsunoda's been driving for 3 years straight, but Tsunoda's still quicker. So you go with the driver that you know is going to be quicker. It's almost kind of a redundant point in some ways. I think if Tsunoda doesn't match Ricciardo, I can't see them getting rid of Tsunoda. I think they just simply wouldn't promote Liam Lawson next season if they decided to keep Ricciardo in the Alpha Tauri because Perez has done enough to keep his Red Bull seat. I think the most likely scenario is that Perez goes, Tsunoda or Ricciardo steps up, Liam Lawson then fills the vacant seat. So yeah, I think it's less critical for Tsunoda, but I do think he is a more critical part than people maybe give him credit for. I think he is still in the Red Bull conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It almost felt like Tsunoda was the alternative that Red Bull could turn to if they were very, very desperate and couldn't get someone else in. We had heard rumours that they were talking to a few other drivers outside of the Red Bull program. I think there were rumours on social media this morning that they'd even approached Charles Leclerc's camp about the possibility of maybe him partnering Max Verstappen, and what a scintillatingly tasty lineup that would have been if it does happen.
Exactly, and I think that's where Yuki is an equally good proposition to Ricciardo, where you kind of think Ricciardo will probably see out the final couple of years of his career in the Red Bull. Tsunoda, I think, could be a good placeholder in the fight for, say, Lando Norris in 2026 or Charles Leclerc, and that again very much speaks to a changing in the philosophy of how that seat, kind of the A-B split, driver 1, driver 2, works in Red Bull. Are they kind of getting ready for Verstappen stepping away? Is that more of a concern than they're maybe letting on? I can't personally see it. I just think they want to have two drivers who are going at it because it makes the sport more entertaining. They keep the dominance, they keep that gap from the rest of the field, but they also get all eyes on them because look how great this title fight is between two drivers. Everyone talks about 2016. Was 2016 a great season, or did you just have a great inter-team battle?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue in a way it was both. I mean, up and down the grid, obviously, you wouldn't argue that. But when the headline act, as we've often said on this show, is the World Championship and who's winning the races, sometimes when that is the exciting story, everything else just doesn't really matter or is immaterial in that regard. But it is an interesting point with Tsunoda. As we've established already, I think Tsunoda's been very good this season. I don't know if Red Bull see him as a serious option for that seat in the future, but if they have a lack of options and alternatives and Tsunoda's proven he is quick enough, then that could open the door for him. But it will be interesting to see how Ricciardo compares to Tsunoda. You do often feel that, at the very least, Ricciardo has to demonstrate that he can beat Tsunoda for the remainder of the season. We'll have to wait and see how that goes.
For sure.
There is an element to this as well with Ricciardo, not just about having his last chance saloon in Formula One, but perhaps a bit of redemption. And Ricciardo winning the Monaco Grand Prix back in, what was it? Was it 2018? I think it was, or 2017. I can't remember which one it was, but a redemption for the season where he should have won the Monaco Grand Prix and they forgot to put all the tyres out for him. So he's familiar with redeeming himself in certain circumstances. And given how things played out at McLaren have had a history where they've often cited problems not of their own doing, or it's out of their control. And we can go on and on and on about the Honda element to this and the Renault engines, etc., etc. And now they're looking in very good shape now, probably the best that they've looked in a long, long time at the moment. An interesting comment Lando Norris made was regarding the weaknesses of the car, i.e. in the slower speed corners, it's still a little bit heavy and laggy sometimes, and that they were only 30% fixed. And this kind of lined up with probably the biggest weakness Ricciardo has in terms of the inconsistencies of the car. He's not able to have that natural feel or drive around a car's problems in the same way that Lando Norris could, but in comparison. Now that Ricciardo's back in Formula One, do you feel that this is an opportunity to perhaps prove once and for all that this wasn't just a Ricciardo problem that led to his downfall at McLaren? This was also a McLaren problem, at the very least, as much as his.
Absolutely. If he can come in and say, and perform well, I don't think he needs to crush Yuki Tsunoda in performance and points. I think he just needs to be competitive with him. I think he can say, like, look, I've still got it. And McLaren just was not the environment for me. It wasn't the car for me. It was. I saw someone giving some analysis and saying that under braking, there wasn't enough kind of feel, or it was counter to Daniel's driving style, which wasn't conducive for a quick lap time. And that is a big part of it. Sometimes you get in a car and, it's different from the one you've been in before. And I think we all think that all F1 cars are the same. They can be very, very different, particularly when you're a driver who's very, very sensitive to incremental changes. And it wasn't the environment for Ricciardo. I also think a lot needs to be said of the McLaren environment generally, which has some similarities to Red Bull. You've got McLaren IndyCar drivers who last season were openly kind of mocking Zach Brown and McLaren for, we've all been practice and test in an F1 car. Like that kind of suggests there's some discontent, some mismanagement, and that clearly all fed into Ricciardo not being where he needed to be to perform. And speaking to your point earlier about Ricciardo not looking as quick as he should have been at the start of the year when he came back to Red Bull, Christian Horner was very quick to say he came back and he was underweight. He came back and he was like, what has happened to this guy? He's entirely different. It just clearly really took its toll on Ricciardo. And I think that improvement, that recovery that he's most likely had over the last 6 or so months is a big reason as to how we got to where we are today.
And that's a great point, because often a Formula One driver's number one asset is confidence. And if an F1 driver isn't driving confidently, or they don't have trust in the car, they're not going to be fast. And there is that element of that with McLaren over the last couple of years. It's just that because they had such an exceptional driver in Lando Norris, it was quite easy to mask those issues where it made Ricciardo look average, when the reality could be that Ricciardo wasn't bad. It's just the car just didn't play to his strengths and he wasn't able to go around it. So that is also an important factor as well. It'll be interesting to see how Ricciardo does in this Alpha Tauri. Can he redeem himself and claw back a little bit of dignity in that regard that perhaps left him when he was at McLaren? Talking about Perez, because I think Perez is a key element to all of this. It's very easy for us to kind of put the dominoes in place saying, okay, this has happened, now this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and Ricciardo's going to end up at Red Bull fighting Max in 2024, and that could be a Titanic championship battle, and everyone is loving that, like Hamilton Rosberg 2.0, but the Red Bull version. It sounds nice on the surface, but with respect to Sergio Perez, ever since Ricciardo came back to Red Bull, it's always felt to me that this is very much a warning to Sergio Perez. we don't have to draw too many conclusions or narratives from what went down at Monaco last season. Max Verstappen being annoyed at Perez, and that obviously filtering through into the Brazilian Grand Prix finish, where Max refused to give up the place to Checo when Max didn't need the points. Checo needed the points for P2. Ultimately, it wouldn't have mattered whether he'd have got it or not, because Charles had enough of a buffer to cover for that. But since Ricciardo's come back into the team, I've always felt that it's been a way that Red Bull have been able to say to Perez, they said, look, we're happy with you at the moment, but if your performance drops beyond a certain threshold for too long a period and it starts to cause us problems, we've got a replacement ready and lined up to take your seat if and when we choose to do so.
That's absolutely spot on, I think. It's very much a tactic from their point. And Perez is the critical factor here, because he's the domino that if he doesn't fall, it makes whatever else happens behind less interesting. It then becomes do you keep Ricciardo in the Alpha Tauri for 2024, or do you put Liam Lawson in it? And that is it, basically. That's the only kind of factor. But if if Perez goes, that's when it goes, well, who goes in the Red Bull? Who goes in the Alpha Tauri? And that's when it kind of gets difficult. I think where Sergio Perez has misplayed his hand this year, and that dissatisfaction, that tension was coming from Brazil, and even before that, the Monaco incident last year, where he wants to be able to take it to Max. But if you shoot the king, you got to kill him. And that's what we've seen this season. He took aim and he missed. And from Miami, it's been a totally different situation for him. So now you've got a situation where publicly they're being very supportive, which is, again, I spoke earlier about this kind of this flip or this reversal in how Red Bull and AlphaTauri are operating. And Christian Horner actually said to me the other night, I think he's the kind of guy that needs an arm around his shoulder, which is very un-Red Bull like in terms of managing a driver. But then he also said, when asked by someone else, when does this lull in qualifying become a concern? And he goes, well, Sergio is still P2 in the championship, and in fact he increased his performance, his gap to Fernando in P2 today, and that is telling. That's low. As long as he's in P2, we're okay. If this goes on much longer, and Fernando can close that gap, that starts to become an issue. So I think, it's not all sunshine and rainbows behind the scenes. How they're managing it could be quite different to how we maybe expect, but ultimately, if he doesn't get it together, and this is where he kind of needs to acquiesce with his position in the team. If he does find that form again, I think now he's lost any opportunity to say, I want to fight for a championship. It's no, if you want to be here, you're the second driver, and that is it. Yeah, that's your role here.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on this one. And the questions are going to keep coming for as long as this poor form continues. And to some degree, this news has probably come at the worst time for Checo, because his form has not been great. We already talked about this already. 5 times he's failed to make it into Q3 in a row. 3 of those he didn't even get out of Q1 in a car that should at the very minimum be qualifying on the front row that his teammate is dominating in at the moment. And yes, his performances have been good on a Sunday where he's been able to recover those positions. I would still argue that Silverstone was a bit of an outlier for that, because he had that safety car to help him. And even then, he only got as far as P6. And there is something that needs to be said for that as well. And now that Ricciardo is coming at this seat at Alpha Tauri, it's going to create even more pressure on Sergio Perez. And whilst perhaps he has kind of rubbished these rumours, or, said he's not too worried about this because he's been in F1 for like 13 years, he's seen it all, he has that contract for next season at the moment, it almost feels right now that the pressure is going to get more and more intense, and he has to find a way to deal with that and be better, because the reality is this situation is very much in Checo's control. This isn't a situation like De Vries found himself in, where it almost felt like it was inevitable that he was going to be replaced, that no matter what he would do, he wasn't the flavour of the month. Red Bull wanted him out. Because the reality is for Checo right now is that if he starts to perform the way that Red Bull want him to, and by that I mean not necessarily beat Max Verstappen, although that wouldn't exactly go against him if he was to do that in certain regards, but if he played the wingman role, if he was able to put himself in the top 2 or in prime position where inevitably, if Max Verstappen has a reliability issue or makes a mistake and isn't able to win a race, Checo is there to capitalise that. And if he can do that in the same way that Bottas did year after year after year when he was Hamilton's teammate, he will still be driving that Red Bull next season. If he's not, and Ricciardo starts performing at the level where people say, oh, actually, he could be in that Red Bull next year, chances are he probably will be.
Completely. And the next race in Hungary is Red Bull's opportunity to take the all-time longest race winning streak from McLaren from the 88 season. If Sergio isn't there in P2 to back to back Max up, I think there's going to be some tension there, because if they lose that because Sergio underperformed in qualifying, I can imagine them, and they'll say it's just a record. But these things you want to show that dominance. You want to show, we've nailed it. I think for Perez, the only way that pressure really comes from below in Alpha Tauri is if Tsunoda continues to score points and Ricciardo crushes him still and is scoring multiple points at various races, or vice versa. And you say, actually, maybe that is where the car is, but this driver is just really outperforming, and actually, do we just make the change anyway? That's the only kind of real situation. It's at this stage in Sergio Perez's hands. He can keep that seat. It's whether he wants to keep that seat ultimately. He needs to win a few races. He needs to continue that streak for a ball. I don't think that causes too many issues now. He's clearly going to get P2 in the championship. But yeah, it's just where does he land? If not Red Bull, where for him?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is the key point, that last part there. Where for him after Red Bull? Because this isn't like a Bottas situation or even a Seb Vettel situation to some respect, or a Raikkonen situation where if they lose their seat at a top team, there'll be other teams in the midfield sort of clamouring to get him in, because where is there to go? There are a lot of these big seats that are locked down long term. There isn't sort of a mid-team project where you can sort of come in and help them out and try and bring them further forward. Maybe somewhere like Alfa Romeo, for example, if I'm clutching at straws, or even Haas, but then would they want to pay the money that Checo would warrant to drive for their teams, or would Checo want to go there? For all argument's sake, I'm with you on this one, Sam. I feel for Checo, this could be make or break for his F1 career. If things do not improve and Ricciardo or even Tsunoda shows the form that Red Bull will raise a few eyebrows with and think, actually, we want them in our car, we could end up in a 2020 situation again with Checo, where he's literally fighting for his F1 career.
Yeah, completely. The only place that seems like a natural fit would be Aston Martin, and Fernando Alonso has been so exceptional that why would you make that change? You just wouldn't.
No, you wouldn't.
And let's face it, unless Lance Stroll turns around and says, "Like, I really just don't want to race anymore. I'm done. I'm fed up. I'm over it." He's surely going to just keep in the seat as long as he wants it.
Yeah, unless there's something absolutely crazy, something worthy of WWE perhaps, where Lawrence Stroll learns that Sergio Perez is his illegitimate son. And of course, this is obviously this is ridiculous here. Like, realms ridiculous. And he's got to find him a seat as well now, because he's got two sons. Yeah, that would be something right out of the WWE playbook. So obviously I'm messing around here, but that's kind of the realms we're going with at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So those options become more and more difficult for Perez. And could you argue that this is an argument for an 11th team? Potentially.
Maybe. I have to have a word with Brad Pitt, see if he's fancies a third driver in his F1 team. But I think that's all we got really time for this one. I think we've covered quite a lot on this one. I'm very excited to see Daniel Ricciardo on the grid again. I'm with you, Sam. I didn't think I was expecting to see that again, but now that it is, I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this plays out. It's a very nice narrative to add to an F1 season, which in some respects we've had to look for narratives to be excited about, excluding the dominance of Max Verstappen and Red Bull at the moment. But before we go, Sam, for the benefit of our listeners and viewers that have tuned into the show, where can they find you on social media to get more great content and analysis from yourself?
So I am on Twitter at Samuel C. Coop. I'm also on Threads, albeit still fairly sporadically, and Instagram. I think I'm at Samuel Thomas Coop there. But Formula Nerds are on socials as well. on Twitter, Threads, Instagram, also FormulaNerds.com. So yeah, we've also got a couple of podcasts, but obviously I don't know if I can plug those.
No,
on your podcast,
of course you can. Please do, because we're going to put all of this in the description in the show notes anyway. So please do plug away.
You can also find us in the podcast world as well. We have the midweek news from the Nerds show, and we also have our race review, which is Cut to the Race. So yeah, we're all over the place. So I'm sure you'll come across us.
Yeah, absolutely great stuff. And I can recommend that, having checked those out personally. Really, really good content. So, get subscribed and get following, guys. But of course, as always, if you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching this. And of course, if you are new, don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform as well. It really helps us out a lot. But until next time, guys, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the Hungarian Grand Prix preview. Of course, we'll be making some new predictions regarding one Daniel Ricciardo. Hotly anticipated. Can't wait to see it, and I'm sure you can't either. But until next time, guys, thanks for tuning in. Please stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.